A little after 5 on the morning the water came, before the sun had cleared the east ridge and while the whole of the low valley still lay under that gray half-light that is neither night nor morning, there was a sound running off the bottom ground that no man in the township had heard in 40 years, and it was the sound of water falling clean over cut stone, steady and level and unhurried, the way water only falls when a thing made by human hands is standing under it and telling it where to go. It came up through the alders and over the wet meadows and along the wagon road, and men who had lived their whole lives within a mile of that ground stood in their traces and could not name it, because not one of them had been born the last time water fell that way in that place. On the firm bank above the bottom, on the strip of high ground that 3 summers before had been the drowned edge of a worthless swamp and was now cropped grass as tight and green as a churchyard, the wagons were drawn up in a long line, and there were 31 of them, and the men had climbed down beside the wheels and stood with their hats in their hands. They were the same men. That is the first thing to hold and to keep. They were the very men who had stood on the courthouse steps 3 summers before and laughed until they had to hold their sides, and now they stood bareheaded in the wet dawn with their milk cows and their work teams, and what was left of a whole year of their labor, roped and lowing behind the wagons, and they waited, and not one of them spoke above the sound of the water. Inside the low house at the top of the rise, a lamp was lit, and a young woman sat at a plank table, with a tin box open in front of her, and a cloth-bound book laid flat under her hand, and she was not looking at the wagons, and she was not looking at the water. She was writing a number in the book. She wet the pencil at her lip, and she wrote the day, and the hour, and the height the water stood, the way she had written it every single morning for 3 summers, and the better part of a 4th. And then she closed the book and folded her 2 hands on top of it, the way a person folds their hands on a thing they mean to keep. And she sat a moment longer in the lamplight with her chin held level and let them wait. She had paid $150 for the ground those men were standing on. That was the whole of it. $150, counted out in worn bills and hard silver on a table in the back of the courthouse. And it had been every cent she owned in the world, and the men at the auction had laughed at her for it, because there is no cheaper thing under God's heaven than 85 acres of standing water, and that is what she had bought. 85 acres of black water and alder scrub and bottomless muck that would not bear the weight of a dog, sold by the county for the back taxes, because no man in 3 counties would lay down $1 for it. She had laid down 150, remember that. And what none of them standing on that bank in the gray light understood, not even then, not even with the water singing its old lost song in their ears and their own drowned fields at their backs, was that the sound they could not name was rising up off a thing that had been lying under the black water the whole of the time, under the muck and the alder roots and 40 years of ruin, a thing built of squared and fitted stone by hands long since gone into the ground. A low wall of dressed gray stone laid clean across the fall of the river to hold and lift and let go the water at a single man's word. A weir. An old mill weir, whole and patient and drowned and waiting, and it had been down there under all that worthless ground on the very day she bought it, and she had not known it either. Not one living soul had known. The men who had tried to drain that bottom and had broken their backs and their banks and their health doing it had walked over the top of that stone 100 times and never once thought to ask what it was their boots were standing on. So the sound went on, falling and falling over the stone in the half-light, and the woman sat with her folded book and her level chin, and the valley she had been pitied in drowned all around her and did not touch her. And to understand how a thing like that comes to pass, you have to leave the drowning morning where it stands, and go a long way back, back before the water fell right, back before the stone showed its face, back to a mill that no man remembered. There had been a mill on that river once, in the years before anyone now living could rightly recall, a grist mill of gray fieldstone and hand-hewn timber that ground the wheat and the buckwheat for the whole of that end of the county, and it had belonged to a man named Enoch Marrow, and to his father before him, and the 2 of them together, across 2 long lives, had built the thing that made the mill possible, which was the weir. They had laid it stone by squared stone, across the shallow fall of the river, a 1/4 mile below the flat, dressing each stone with a chisel and setting it true. And the weir did the one thing a mill on a lazy river cannot do without, which is that it lifted the water. It gathered the slow river and held it back and raised it into a smooth, deep head that would turn a wheel, and it stood there year on year, doing that patient work. And it did a second work besides that fewer men understood, and no man now remembered, because Enoch Marrow had cut gates into the low end of the weir, oak paddles that rose and fell in stone slots, and in a wet spring, when the river came up in a brown flood, the miller would go down in the rain and haul those gates and let the water down through the race and send the river along fast and low so that it never once spread out over the flat. The weir was not a wall against the water. It was a hand laid on the water's throat, and the hand knew when to hold and when to let go. And while a Marrow lived to work the gates, the 85 acres above the mill were the finest hay meadow in the township, deep black ground that grew grass to a horse's belly, and the water did exactly as it was told. Then the last of the Marrows died. Enoch went first of a winter fever, and then his son within the year, and the mill burned in a dry autumn from a spark no one saw, and the timber that was not burned was carried off, and the daughters married away out of the county, and there was no one left who knew the gates or cared to learn them. And a weir with no hand on it is only a wall. The oak paddles rotted in their stone slots and jammed, and the leaves and the drift came down and lodged against them, and a colony of beaver found the slack water and were glad of it and built where the race had run, and the silt that a working mill sluices out every spring settled instead year on year against the drowned stone, and behind it, a foot, and then 2 feet, and then more, until the fall of the river was choked and buried, and the water no longer knew where to go. And a river that does not know where to go stops going. It backed up over the low flat above the mill, slow and patient, and without any malice in it at all, and it drowned the finest hay meadow in the township one wet season at a time. And the alder came, the gray water-loving alder that seeds itself in a wet foot of ground and holds it. And in 20 years, the meadow was a swamp, and in 40 years, the very word for it had changed, and the oldest men called the place the mill flat out of habit, and could not one of them have told you why? Because the mill was gone, and the mill race was gone, and the name of Marrow was gone, and the weir, the whole and living heart of the whole matter, lay under 6 feet of black water and 40 years of muck, and never rotted and never moved, holding its dressed stone shape in the dark, keeping the memory of its purpose the way a thing built true keeps its purpose long after the men who built it are forgotten, waiting, in no hurry, for a hand to come and ask it back to work. And no man in the valley knew it was there. That is the whole of the reason the story could happen at all. And it is why it must begin with a stone that no one remembered, drowned in the dark, being patient. To understand the water falling over that stone on the morning the valley drowned, you have to go back 3 summers and a season. To the spring the county could not give the low ground away, and to the young widow who gave it every cent she had. Her name was Della Renner, and she was 24 years old that spring, and she had buried her husband in the frozen ground of the January before. He had been a hired man named Tom Renner, a good and stubborn man with more heart than luck, and he had spent the last 2 years of his short life renting a wet corner of the Voss bottom and digging open ditches by hand from the dark before dawn until the dark after, standing to his knees in ice water trying to make drowned ground pay a rent it would never pay. And the wet had gotten into his chest that last winter and would not leave, and he had died coughing in the 2-room house with the leaking roof, and left her what a man like that leaves, which was not much, and it can be counted, and counting it is the plainest way to know her. She owned, on the spring day the county held its tax sale, 1 pair of old oxen named Buck and Bright, slow and honest and going gray at the muzzle, that Tom had bought half broke and gentled himself. She owned 6 young steers, half wild and rough-coated, that the Haggard farm had given her in place of the last summer's wages they could not pay her dead husband in cash, mean-tempered scrub cattle that no one else had wanted. She owned a 2-wheeled cart with 1 cracked wheel that she had mended herself with wire and a strip of iron cut off a barrel hoop. She owned the lease on the little house, $4 the month, paid to the Voss estate. She owned a debt of $11.40 at Skeel's store, run up over the sick winter, that she paid down $1 at a time whenever $1 came, and Skeel wrote each dollar in his book with a look on his face that she had learned to walk past without letting it into her. She owned her husband's silver watch, which had stopped at 20 minutes past 4 on the afternoon he died, and which she wound every night of her life, though it would not run, because winding it was a thing her hands did that her heart could not stop. She owned the wedding band on her finger, which she would not have sold to save her life, and she owned $150 in the tin box, the sum of 2 hard years of saving, and the whole of what the sale of Tom's tools and his good coat and his rifle had brought, which was all the money she had, and, by every sign the world had shown her, all the money she was ever likely to have. And on the spring day of the tax sale, she carried the whole of that $150 in the tin box down to the courthouse and laid it all, every worn bill and every hard coin of it, on 85 acres of water that the county could not give away. And that is the act that fixed the town's mind about her. And to understand the town's mind, you have to understand that they did not hate her, which she could have borne. They pitied her, which is the heavier thing to carry and the harder to forgive, and she carried it a long time. The town had already decided about Della Renner before the auctioneer ever opened his mouth. They had decided in the way a town decides such things, not in any meeting and not out loud, but among themselves at the store counter and over the fences and in the pews, deciding a little at a time until the thing was settled and no one remembered deciding it. A poor young widow with no people and no land and no luck, they had settled, a woman who had already buried one man to the wet ground and was now, God help her, throwing her last dollar into the very same water that killed him. The kindest of them were the worst, because the kindest of them shook their heads slow and said it was a crying shame, and a poor foolish girl did not know any better, and they said it where she could hear, meaning it gently, and gentleness of that kind is a stone laid on a person's chest. Scorn a body can push back against and grow hard against and even feed on, but there is no pushing back against pity, because pity has already buried you and put a flower on you and turned to go home. She learned to walk through the middle of it with her chin held level and her eyes ahead and her hands quiet at her sides, and she learned it the way you learn to stop feeling a cold you cannot get out of, which is not the same as getting warm. But there was one thing about Della Renner that the whole pitying town could not see, and did not count, and could not have put a price on if you had made them try, and it was the one thing the whole of the story would turn upon. She watched water. She had watched it since she was a girl small enough to sit on the riverbank and drop sticks in and follow them, and where another child watched the stick, she watched the water that carried it, watched how it ran fast in the narrows and lay still in the bends, how it climbed a certain stone in a rain and left a dark mark, and how the mark told you a thing, how in a flat field the water was never truly still but was always feeling its slow way towards some lower place it wanted to reach. She had a way of standing at the edge of wet ground and going quiet and reading it the way a man reads weather that is deciding whether to turn bad, and she did a thing besides watching that not one soul in the county thought to do, which was that she wrote it down. She kept a cloth-bound book and a stub of pencil, and in the book she wrote the water, the day, and the height, and which way it ran, and how long it stood, and how fast it fell after a rain, plain numbers in a plain hand, kept faithfully for no reason she could have given anyone, kept because a thing worth watching was a thing worth remembering, and a thing worth remembering was a thing worth writing down so it could not lie to you later. The town saw a poor widow with a foolish habit. They did not see that she was the only person in the valley keeping a record of the one thing the valley did not understand. And they did not see that the water, which had ruined every man who ever fought it there, had never once been watched by anyone patient enough to learn what it wanted, until her. Because men had fought that water. That is the part the town knew by heart, and told and retold, and it was the reason they were so certain about the 85 acres. For the drowning of the mill flat was not only an old story of a burned mill and a dead miller, it was also a long story of stubborn men who had come after and set their whole lives against the standing water, and lost, every one of them, and the losing had passed into the town as a kind of law, a thing everybody knew, which was that the low ground could not be drained, and it was folly to try. There had been a man named Renfrew. First, a hard-handed farmer with a little money, who bought a piece of the flat cheap 30 years gone, and swore he would ditch it dry, and he dug open ditches straight as a rule across the whole of his piece, and for one dry summer they ran, and then the black silt slumped in and filled them, and the alder seeded the spoil banks, and the water came back exactly as high as it had been, and Renfrew dug them again, and it filled again, and he spent his money, and then he sold his stock to keep digging, and then he had nothing, and he left the county, and the town said, "There, you see." And after Renfrew, there had come men with more than a shovel. There had come a drainage company out of Chicago, in the flush years, men in good coats with a printed prospectus and money raised on bonds. And they had looked at the drowned flat and seen cheap land that could be made dear. And they had brought a steam dredge on rail and a great iron pump, and they had cut one enormous straight ditch clean down the middle of the bottom, a canal near, and set the pump at the low end to throw the water into the river. And for a season, the smoke of it stood over the swamp, and the town came out on Sundays to watch, and it was a marvel. And it failed. It failed because the ditch silted at its own mouth faster than the dredge could clear it. And it failed because the pump could throw water all day and all night, and the water only stood back up behind it by morning. And it failed most of all because it never occurred to a single well-coded man among them to ask where the river went when it left the flat, to walk that quarter-mile downstream and wonder why a whole river came to a lazy dead halt in a beaver-grown thicket, to ask, in a word, not where the water stood, but where it fell and why it had stopped falling. They fought the water where they found it, standing, and the water always came back to stand again, because the cause of the standing lay a quarter-mile off under 6 feet of muck, and no one had ever gone to look. The pump rusted where it sat. The company failed, and the bonds went bad, and the men in the good coats went back to Chicago, and the great ditch became just one more drowned scar in the swamp. And the town said again, "There, you see." And the saying hardened into the law it had been all along, and the land went for taxes at last, because a thing everyone knows to be worthless truly does become worthless, and stays that way until one person declines to know it. Della Renner declined to know it. She came to the tax sale on the courthouse steps on a raw spring morning, and she stood at the back in her mended coat while the auctioneer read off the descriptions of the county's dead parcels. And when he came to the 85 acres of the old mill flat, he read it in a bored, flat voice. And then he looked up and half smiled and said, "Was there any bid at all, gentlemen? Any bid on the finest duck pond in the township?" And the men on the steps laughed, an easy, comfortable laugh, and someone called out to let the state keep its frogs. And the auctioneer laughed too and made to move on. And Della said her number. She said $150 in a plain, steady voice she had spent a hard year learning to keep steady. And the steps went quiet, and then they laughed the harder, because the joke was better now. The poor widow bidding her whole dead husband's savings on the drowned ground that had killed him. And the auctioneer looked at her a long moment to be sure she was not simple, and then he took the money because money is money, and he wrote it down, and she carried the deed out folded in her hand through the middle of the laughter, with her chin level, and did not run, and did not answer, and that silence was the truest answer she ever gave any of them. There was one man on the courthouse steps that morning who did not laugh, and he was an old man named Silas Cobb, and no one counted him either, which was the very reason he saw her clear. Silas Cobb was not of that country. He had come up years before from the drowned tidewater down the coast, from a flat, wet country of tides and marsh and reeds, where the sea came in twice a day, and men lived off ground that was under water half of every day of their lives. And he kept a flock of gray geese on the sedge along the river below the town, and lived alone in a tar paper shack and spoke to almost no one. And the town regarded him the way a town regards a strange old man who keeps geese, which is to say it did not regard him at all. But Silas Cobb had spent 70 years reading water for his bread in a country where a man who could not read water drowned, and when he saw a young widow lay down her last coin on 85 acres of standing water that everyone else called worthless, he did not see a fool. He saw the only person in the valley who had done the one thing that might, in the fullness of years, be right. And he came down the steps after her, slow on his stick, and he stopped her at the corner where the laughter could not quite reach, and he did a small thing with his hand. He wet the first 2 fingers of his right hand at his own mouth, and he held them up a moment in the raw spring air, and then he let a single bright drop of the water fall from them to the ground, and he watched it fall and land, and he pointed one crooked finger down at the little dark mark it made in the dust, and then he raised his eyes to her, and he said the thing that she would carry the rest of her days, and that this whole account exists to bring back around. He said, "Water spoils no ground." He said it slow, as though the words cost him money, and he was counting them out and would not spend one more than the truth needed. "It only keeps it a while," he said, "and the ground it keeps the longest it gives back the richest. to the one who learns where the water wants to go. And then he told her one thing more. Because he was old, and he had watched that flat drown across his whole time in the county, and he had thought about it in the way a lonely old man thinks a thing to the bottom. And he told her there had been a mill down there once, and a weir of stone, and that if she wanted her ground she must not fight the water where it stood, as all the fools had, but must go and find where the water used to fall, and set it falling again, and let it work. And then he touched his hat to her, which no other man in that county had done, and he went back to his geese, and she stood at the corner with the deed to a swamp folded in her hand, and the words folded away inside her where she meant to keep them, and she went home to the 6 half-wild steers and the 2 gray oxen, because she had no money for dredges, and no money for pumps, and no money for ditchers, and the only tools she owned in all the world were animals, and she meant to use them. What she did with those animals is the heart of the whole matter, and it is worth the telling slow. Because it was slow, and because a man who has only heard the ending would not believe it could be done at all until he has heard exactly how, and then he would concede that it might. She had no way to throw the water off the land. But she had 6 steers and 2 oxen and a great deal of alder, and she knew from watching that the alder was not only the sign of the wet, it was part of the cause of it, for the gray thickets stood so close and so dense that they held the black water in their shade and their roots, and never let the sun or the wind at it to dry a single foot. And she knew from watching, too, that cattle will eat young alder, will browse the tender shoots and strip the bark and break down the whippy stems to get at what grows behind, and that the weight of a beast standing and treading on soft wet ground does a thing to that ground over time, packs it and firms it and closes the black ooze and beats down a path a man can walk, where the week before there was only sucking muck. So she began, that first spring, at the driest, firmest margin of the 85 acres, at the high edge where the swamp gave onto the strip of solid bank, and she turned the 6 steers and the 2 oxen onto that margin and let them work. And they worked. They did not know they worked. They only ate and tramped and dunged and lay down and rose and ate again. But a beast doing that on the edge of a swamp week after week is doing labor no ditch can do, for the ditch fights the water, and the beast changes the ground, and changed ground does not need to be fought. The steers browsed the alder margin back to bare stems and then browsed the stems, and the alder, hard as it is to kill, does not love to be eaten to the ground season on season, and it thinned. Their sharp hooves cut the sod and then, in the drying, knit it, and where 100 head of cattle would have poached soft ground to a ruin, 8 head worked slow enough that the treading firmed more than it tore, and their trails, the narrow beaten paths they wore going into the good browse and coming out to the water, those trails packed down hard and low and became, without her digging a spade of dirt, the first small runnels down which the surface water began, just barely, to move. She watched it move. Every evening she stood at the edge with her cloth-bound book, and she wrote the day and where the water stood, and how the margin had dried a hand's breadth further in, or had not, and the numbers went into the book faithfully, whether they were good numbers or bad, and slowly, across that first summer, they were more often good. It was not clean, and it was not sure, and it did not go in a straight line, because nothing real does. That first summer she lost a steer. A young roan pushed too far out onto ground the others had not yet firmed, and went down in a bog hole to its brisket and could not get out, and she worked half a day in the black muck with the oxen and a rope, and got a chain on it at last, and it was dead of the cold and the fright before she could draw it clear, and she sat on the bank beside the dead steer with her wet arms around her knees and did not cry, because she had learned that a while back, and in the evening she took out the book and she wrote where the bog hole was, so that she would never again send a beast into it, and that was the difference between her and every man who had failed on that ground, that a loss to them was a defeat, and a loss to her was a line in the book. 5 steers then, and the 2 gray oxen, and the second year they went further. By the second autumn, the high margin bore the weight of the oxen dry-shod clear across a corner that the year before would have swallowed the cart, and she cut the first small crop of coarse wild hay off that corner, and it was poor hay, but it was hay off ground that had grown nothing but alder in 40 years. And she stood in it a while in the low sun, and then she went in and wrote the weight of it in the book. And all that, while she was doing the other thing, the reading, the going down along the choke of the river, a quarter-mile below, to stand and watch where the water fell, or would not fall, because Silas Cobb had told her to find where the water used to fall, and she had believed him. She went to the courthouse besides, in a slack week of the second winter, and she asked the clerk for the old records of the mill flat, the deeds and the plats going back, and she sat in the cold record room and read them with her finger, slow, for she was no great reader, and she found in the oldest deed of all, in the crabbed hand of a clerk 50 years dead, the words that Enoch Merrow's grandfather had caused to be written, granting with the land, the mill seat and the weir, and the head and the fall of water thereunto belonging, and she read those words 3 times and copied them out careful into the back of her cloth-bound book, the mill seat and the weir and the head and the fall of water thereunto belonging, because she did not yet fully know what they would be worth, but she knew, the way she knew weather, that they would be worth something, and a thing worth remembering is a thing worth writing down. She read one thing more in that cold room, a thing the clerk showed her half in idleness, which was the old law of the water on that river, that a right to hold and work the water lived only by the working of it, and that a mill or a works, left standing idle, let its right to the water fall into disuse, and lapse, and belong to no one at all, until such time as some hand should take up the water and put it back to work, and then it should belong to that hand. She wrote that down too, in her plain way, and folded the book and went home, and did not yet know she had just written down the sentence that would beat a rich man 3 summers on. The 3rd summer was a dry one, the kind of long, rainless summer the town cursed for its brown pastures and its low wells, and it was the making of her, for the drought drew the swamp down further than she had ever seen it, and let her steers push into the very middle of the 85 acres, where the water had always stood too deep to tread. And there, in the low black heart of the drowned flat, working a dry August corner a 1/4 mile above the river's choke, the cattle did the thing that no dredge and no pump and no ditcher had done in 40 years. They uncovered the stone. It was the roan white ox Bright that found it first. Or found it for her. Standing hock deep in a corner the drought had bared, and pawing at something under its foot that would not give the way muck gives. And Della came out to see what the ox was worrying at, and she knelt down in the black August ooze, and put her bare hand down into it, and under a foot of muck, her fingers came against an edge, a true straight-dressed edge of cut stone, squared and level and laid by a hand, running away to either side under the mud farther than she could feel. And she knelt there a long moment with her hand on it in the heat and the fly drone, and she understood, all at once and all the way down, what it was her boots, and every failed man's boots had been standing on the whole time. It was the top of the weir, the old drowned weir of Enoch Merrow, whole and true and sound under 40 years of silt, exactly where the words in the old deed had promised it, and it had been down there in the dark waiting all along, and now, in a dry August of a dry year, worked bare by half-wild steers she had gotten in place of a dead man's wages, it had shown her its face. She did not tell a soul. She came out day after day through the last of that dry summer, and she cleared the drowned weir with her own 2 hands, and the 2 oxen and a chain, hauling off the beaver rack and the sunk timber, and the 40 years of muck. And it was terrible, slow, filthy work, and she did it alone in the heat, and told no one. Because she had learned in a hard school that a thing not yet finished is a thing best not spoken of, and because she wanted to be sure. And when she had the crown of the old stone cleared, she saw the stone slots where Enoch Merrow's oak gates had risen and fallen, the rotted stubs of them still in the slots, and she understood the whole of the machine of it then, understood that the weir did not only hold the water back but could let it down, and she measured the slots careful with a string, and she took the string to a man 2 townships over, who did not know her and did not laugh, and she had him cut her a new oak gate to the measure, and she paid for it out of the first real hay money, and hauled it home in the mended cart. And on a still gold morning in the very end of that 3rd summer, she set the new gate down into the old stone slots that had waited 40 years to be filled, and she braced it, and then she hauled it up on its new rope the way the old miller had once done in the rain, and she opened the fall of the water. And the river, which had stood dead and spread and drowning over the flat for 40 years because a foot of silt over a drowned weir had choked its fall, felt the choke give way beneath it at last, and it moved. It gathered itself and it slid down over the crown of the old dressed stone and fell, clean and level and singing, over the weir and down the long dead race, the first water to fall over that stone since before any man now living was born. And she stood on the bank in the gold light with the wet rope in her 2 hands and listened to a sound the valley had forgotten, and behind her, across the 85 acres, so slow you could not see it move but so sure you could measure it in the book by morning, the water began to go down. Within 3 weeks, a whole reach of the low ground that had been black water at midsummer lay bare and steaming and then greening, and a thing like that cannot be hid, and the word of it ran up the valley the way water runs, that the Renner widow had somehow set the old swamp to draining, and men who had laughed came out along the river road and stood at the fence and looked at bare black ground where they had shot ducks the autumn before, and could not account for it, and went away not laughing but not yet doing anything else either. And it was then, when the value had first showed its face above the water, and not 1 hour before, that the smooth man came. His name was Otis Loomis, and he drove out to her place in a good buggy behind a good horse on a fine afternoon in the fall, a well-fed, well-spoken man in a gray town suit with soft, clean hands and a leather case on the seat beside him, and he came up her lane smiling and calling her Mrs. Renner in a warm and sorry voice, as though he had known and grieved her a long time, and he was the agent, he said, of the Ashford Mill and Land Company, which held interests along the river, and he had heard, he said, of her hard struggle out here all alone, a young widow, and he had come, he said, as a friend, to spare her some trouble. He talked a long while, and he talked well, and everything he said was dressed in kindness and regret, the way a trap is dressed in leaves. He said the company had held, these many years, a recorded right to the water at the old mill weir, a right of record, filed and paid for and lawful, going back to when the company had bought up the Marrow interests after the mill burned. He was sorry to say it, he said, truly sorry, for he could see how hard she had labored, but the water she had lately taken to meddling with was not, in law, hers to meddle with, and any improvement she had made upon it belonged, he feared, to the holders of the right, and she stood, though she surely had not meant to, in a position of some legal danger that a woman alone could ill afford. But the company, he said, was not a hard company, and he himself was not a hard man, and rather than see her ruined by a lawsuit she could never hope to win, he was authorized, out of pure goodwill, to buy the whole 85 acres and the weir, and be done, in cash. Today, a clean and generous end to all her trouble, and he named a sum, and it was a large sum set beside $150, and it was a beggar's sum set beside what that ground would be worth, dry. And he laid a paper on her table and set a pen beside it, and folded his soft hands and waited, warm and sorry and sure. Della Renner did not touch the pen. She stood on the far side of her own plank table, with her hands quiet at her sides, and she let him talk himself all the way out, the way she had learned to let the town talk itself out, and she watched him the way she watched water, going quiet and reading him. And somewhere in the long, warm flow of his kindness, the smooth man made the one slip that undid him, as such men always do, for their flaw is that they cannot stop talking and cannot bear a silence, and he filled her silence with one sentence too many. He said, waving a soft hand out toward the bright bare ground where the water had gone down, that it was a wonder to see. He would grant her that, a real wonder, for the company's own men had measured the water on that flat every year, and it had never once in 40 years stood a foot below the 7-foot mark, and here she had it down to the grass, and it was a marvel, and a pity she could not keep it. And Della Renner went very still, because he had told her something without meaning to, and she had caught it, the way she caught everything about water and held it. The company's own men had measured the water on that flat every year for 40 years. Every year. For 40 years, the Ashford Mill and Land Company had sent men out to that drowned, worthless swamp and measured the height of the water on it and written the number down, which is not a thing any company on earth does to a piece of ground it believes worthless, which is a thing a company does only to a thing it is watching and waiting on, and means one day to have. And the whole of the smooth man's kindness fell away from his words in that instant, like silt washing off stone, and she saw the shape of it plain. They had known the whole time the weir was down there and whole. They had known what the flat could be worth dry, and they had been content to let it lie drowned and let man after man break himself against it, content to watch and measure and wait. Because a right to water you do not have to work is a cheap thing to hold, and a swamp is a cheap thing to buy at last for taxes, and they had only ever meant to let some other fool spend his life proving it could be drained and then to step in with their paper and take it. And she had been the fool. Only she had not spent her life. She had kept a book. She said one thing to Otis Loomis, and it was the shortest thing said in that room by a long way, and it was the truest. She took her cloth-bound book down from the shelf, and she opened it to the copied words and the copied law, and she turned it around on the table so that it faced him, and she set one finger on the line where she had written, 2 winters gone, the old law of the water off the courthouse plat, that a right to the water lived only by the working of it, and that a works left idle let the right lapse and belong to no one, until a hand took up the water and put it back to work. And, she said, read the date. That was all. Read the date. And she turned the pages, and there were the dates. 3 summers of them. Every day written plain. The day she first turned the steers onto the margin, and the day the stone showed its face, and the day, set down in her own hand with 2 neighbor men signed under it as witnesses, because she had thought even then to have it witnessed, that she raised the new gate, and the water fell over the weir, and she put the water back to work. 40 years the company had let the weir lie idle and drowned, and worked no gate and moved no water, and 40 years a right unworked is a right lapsed and gone. That was the county's own law, and it was written in the county's own book downtown, and she had read it and copied it, and could point any judge in the state to the page, and the water belonged now, by that same law, to the one hand that had taken it up and put it back to work, and that hand was hers, dated and witnessed, and the paper the smooth man had laid on her table was a claim upon a thing his own people had let die, and it was worth exactly what 40 years of idleness had made it worth, which was nothing. She did not say most of that. She did not need to. She had said read the date, and she had turned the book, and the smooth man read it, and the warmth went out of his face like heat out of a stone at nightfall, and he gathered up his paper without another word about goodwill, and he folded it away in his leather case, and he drove his good horse back down her lane in the failing light, and he did not come again. The following spring the rains came and did not stop. It began wet, and it stayed wet, and by the end of April the old men were saying they could not recall its like, and the river came up brown and heavy, and kept coming, and all up and down the valley, the farms on the flats, the good conventional farms of the men who had laughed, the farms that had always been dry, because they had never had a weir drowned under them, and had never needed to learn the water, went under. They had no way to shed it. They had never in their lives had to think where the water fell, because it had always fallen off on its own, and now the whole swollen river wanted to spread, and there was nothing any of them could do but stand on their porches and watch the brown water climb their fields, and float their hay, and drown their spring planting, and stand at last in their dooryards, and the drainage they had trusted their whole lives to, the natural fall of the land, was not enough against a river in a year like that, and the men who knew everything about farming and nothing about water learned in 3 wet weeks what the drowned flat had been trying to teach the valley for 40 years, which is that water is not a thing you can afford to forget about, only until the year it decides to remember you. And on the old mill flat, on the 85 acres everyone had pitied and laughed at, the widow Renner stood at the head of the water with an iron key and a raised gate, and did the one thing no other soul in the valley could do. She commanded it. When the river rose, she went down in the rain, as Enoch Marrow had gone down in the rain 50 years before, and she hauled her oak gate, and let the water fall through the weir, and down the long race, and sent the flood along fast and low, so that it never once spread over her ground. And she raised the gate higher when the river raged, and eased it when the river fell, holding and letting go, holding and letting go, a hand laid on the water's throat that knew when to hold and when to let go. And her 85 acres of black bottomland, the finest and deepest soil in the whole township now that the water had given it back, stood green and firm and dry, in the middle of a drowning valley, exactly as the old deed and the old miller and the old goosekeeper had always known it could. And more than that, for the race she had opened carried so much of the rising river along and away that even some of the low fields below her, fields belonging to men who had laughed at her on the courthouse steps, were spared the worst of the flood because the weir above them was drawing the water off, and the men on those fields, standing in the one dry corner the widow's gate had left them, understood at last, slow and shamed and grateful all at once, what she had bought for $150, and what they had laughed at, and what it was worth to them now. Which is how it came to be that a little after 5 on the morning the water was highest, The same 31 families who had laughed came up her lane with their wagons, and their surviving stock roped behind, and drew up in a long line on her firm green bank, and got down and stood with their hats in their hands, and waited, not laughing, for the poor foolish widow to save what was left of their year. They had come to beg the one thing in the valley that could not be bought at any store, which was dry ground, standing room for their cattle above the flood, and the drawing off of the water from the fields they could still hope to save. And they stood bareheaded and waited on her word, and inside the house she wrote the morning's water height in the book, as she had written it every morning for 3 summers and part of a 4th, and folded her hands upon it a moment and let them wait, not out of any cruelty and not to make them small, but because a thing worth doing is worth doing in its own time. And then she took the heavy iron key down from its nail by the door, and went out past the whole silent line of them, to the head of the water, and set the key to the gate, and opened the fall. And the water went over the old stone clean and level and singing, and every man on that bank took off his hat if it was not off already, and no man among them said a word. And the sound of the water falling over the weir was the only sound in the grey valley, and it was the sound this whole account began with, and now you know what it was. She took their cattle onto her ground, all of them, hundreds of head onto the 85 acres that would carry them, and she drew the water off the fields that could be saved, and she did not do it for nothing, and that is the last thing to understand about her and the truest. She set a price. She set a fair price and a plain one, so much a head for the season's grazing on the only dry pasture in the county, and it was not a low price, and she did not pretend it was, because the grass was hers and it had cost her 3 summers of the one life she had. And a woman who lets the world take a thing for less than it is worth has learned nothing from the world that took her husband, and she was no fool, not any longer, not ever again. But to the men who came to her with nothing left, whose year was under the brown water entire, and who could not have paid her $1 to save their souls, to those men she gave the grass on a handshake and a line in her book, credit against the next good year, their names written in the same plain hand that had written the water every morning, to be paid when they could and no sooner, and no shame in it, and that, and not the price, and not the water, and not even the being proved right at the long last, was the thing the valley told about her after, the thing that turned the pity clean inside out into something that had no laughter left in it anywhere at all. And the years ran on the way years do, and the water gave the ground back the way old Silas Cobb had said it would, and the 85 acres of the old mill flat became within a few seasons the richest black bottom land in the whole of that county, deep and sweet and sure, growing grass to a horse's belly and corn over a man's head, and it was worth, that ground, more than every dry acre for miles that had once looked down on it, and the arithmetic of that was a thing the town did the way you cannot help doing a sum that will not leave you be. $150 laid down on 85 acres of water that no man in 3 counties would give $1 for, and the whole valley living off it in the end. And old Silas Cobb, who had touched his hat to her at the corner when no other man would, she brought up onto her dry bank and gave him grass for his gray geese and a warm tight cabin out of the wind, and his meals at her table, and he lived out his last years content on the ground he had known could be reclaimed, before another soul in the county believed it, and he died old and dry and easy one winter, and she buried him on the high bank above the weir where he could hear the water. And the Sattler boy, young Amos Sattler, whose own father had drowned years before in one of the very drainage ditches that never worked, taken by the same water in the same flat, him she took in when he was orphaned and had no one, and she taught him the book and the water and the gate. And he kept the ledger for her in a hand that grew steadier every year, grave and careful beyond his age, and he learned where the water wanted to go, until he could read it nearly as well as she could, and he grew up to work the weir after her, and to teach it in his turn. And Otis Loomis and his company were heard of no more in that valley, for a right that has lapsed is worth nothing and cannot be sold, and the paper went back into some drawer in some town office and yellowed there, and the smooth man took his good buggy and his soft hands to some other county, to wait on some other fool, and no one in the valley ever spoke his name again, and that was the whole of his punishment, which was to be forgotten, which is the only punishment such men truly fear. And Della Renner grew old on her black ground, and never wanted, and never gloated, and wound a stopped silver watch every night of her long life, and watched the water every morning, and wrote it in the book. And near the end of it, when she was old and gray and content, and the mistress of the finest ground in the county, there came up her lane one raw spring afternoon, a young woman in a mended coat, a stranger, poor and alone, the way she herself had once been poor and alone, come to look at some cheap, wet, worthless piece of ground down the river that everyone had told her was folly to want, and the girl found the old woman standing at the head of the water, where she was most often to be found, and asked her, shy and half ashamed of the asking, whether drowned ground could ever be made to come to anything at all, or whether it was folly, as they all said. And Della Renner looked at the girl a long moment, and she saw the whole of her own young self standing there in the mended coat, and she did the small thing that had been done to her at a courthouse corner a lifetime before. She wet the first 2 fingers of her right hand at her own mouth, and she held them up a moment in the raw spring air, and let a single bright drop fall from them to the ground, and watched it land, and pointed one old crooked finger down at the little dark mark it made, and then she raised her eyes to the girl, and gave her the words that had been given to her, the very words, unchanged, that she had carried folded inside her for 50 years. Water spoils no ground, it only keeps it a while, and the ground it keeps the longest it gives back the richest, to the one who learns where the water wants to go. And she turned then and looked out over the 85 acres of black bottom land that $150 had bought, green to the far trees under the gray spring sky, and she did not say anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying. And beside her, the young stranger looked out at the same ground, and below them, both the river slid down over the crown of the old dressed stone, and fell, clean and level and unhurried and sure, over the weir and down the long race and on, the way it had fallen every hour of every day for all the years since she first set the gate, the way it went on falling after the old woman was gone and the girl was old, and every soul who had ever laughed was dust, going and going and going, the sound of water falling over stone, telling the ground where to go.